Way back in the early 90s, my first Dreadnought was one of these. I also had one of these around 5th edition, but a bit of a failed Space Wolves army attempt. I only played 2 games with it before I sold it. My love affair with Warhammer 40,000 really kind of ended with 2nd edition, and I moved on to other things, so I've always loved the lore. I still like to keep an eye on Warhammer 40,000, and when these released they look pretty cool, and I painted one for a commission and had lots of fun with it. With the launch of the Leviathan, I absolutely fell in love with the new Terminators, and I decided to build a very small 1,000 point Terminator only force. I say only, there's a Dreadnought and some characters in it as well, and the idea is to have the army in my cabinet should I ever want to play a quick fun game of Warhammer 40,000. I quite like the idea of having armies there to play pickup games with people and enjoy the social side of the hobby, even if I don't get into the game in a big way. So having already painted one of the new Terminators for a tutorial, I've got around to painting my Ballistus Dreadnought, and I thought it'd be really nice to make that a tutorial as well. It expands on the way I paint those Terminators, and I get to show off a little bit more about my thoughts and techniques for painting slightly larger miniatures to a tabletop gaming standard. So welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and let's work through this Terminator tutorial. So these new miniatures are push fit, I believe. I did glue them together. The weapons arms themselves fit very nicely, so that you can just pop them off without any magnets or anything like that. They just twist and then come out of their joints. So I'm removing those to paint to make it a little bit easier to get into the crevices and things. And with the miniature primed black, I was able to crack straight in. And I'm starting with the metals here, and this is scale colour decayed metal. I like to do my metals first on these. I can mask them off and I can work on the much cleaner areas afterwards. Anything that you can't really remove them in a miniature to paint separately, like these engines and things at the back here. So I'm applying this darker brown metal first. Bit of an odd choice, you might think. I just like the way that using it as a bit of an underpaint really helps build up the tones, and this is my go-to standard metal that I do on an awful lot of miniatures. I obviously vary it at times, but this seems to be in my default, and I've decided to use it for this army. So I'll continue around the miniature, work on to the weapons as well. I'm doing my best to keep the decayed metal away from the black areas as much as possible. There will be some overspray, that doesn't matter too much, but I will return it to black, as you'll see a little bit later, because it just helps the later processes. Next up is probably the most important one. This is black metal from the same range, and it kind of forms the bulk of the main metal colour. So it's not a brown metal colour, it is a silver metal colour. This is a kind of a gunmetal style effect, but I just tend to leave a little bit of the brown showing through, that kind of bronzy brown, and it just gives a real depth to the miniature, almost shades your metals without adding any extra, which we'll do later on. I just like the effect. It's not something that everyone needs to do. You could just go straight in with the duller gunmetal if you wanted to. As before, I go round and complete the same process on the guns as well, just leaving a little bit of that brown showing through here and there. And for the top highlight, my go-to is always Game Air Silver, but this is a really bright and vibrant metallic colour, and I'm essentially highlighting here with it, so trying to be as subtle as possible. A little bit of a mistake here or there will be hidden when I use oils and things later on, but I'm just trying to pick out the tops or the areas that really stand out and would catch the light. Again, we move on to the weapons, and I'm really focusing there on the tips of the barrels and then in the centre, so to really kind of reinforce the shadowed areas. Now I'm going to paint in the heat bloom now on the guns, on the smokestacks. I want to get this all out the way and masked off so I can paint the rest of the Dreadnought. So I'm airbrushing here some Nasdrag yellow contrast paint with a little bit of water added to help it flow. I'm just aiming for the tips of the weapons and the tips of the smokestacks. And once that's dry, I go in with Contrast Blood Angels Red. You could use Flesh Terror as well. This I thinned a little bit more, probably 2 parts contrast to 1 part water. And again, just touching just the edge of the weapons here, making sure that some of that yellow is still showing. And I will do the same on the smokestacks, again trying to be careful not to get it too far down the rest of the miniature, almost aiming across the top so the overspray misses the rest, making sure I leave some yellow. The final stage I'm using is purple. There's 2 options for you here: Shyish Purple if you're a contrast user, and then there's Hive Dweller Purple from Army Painter Speed Paint. I'm actually using that in this instance, mostly because I've run out of the Shyish Purple, but the dropper bottle does make it very easy to go into the airbrush, and it's also a little bit thinner, so it doesn't require as much thinning. But as you can see, again, I'm just aiming a little bit further up on those miniatures, trying to catch the very, very top, and it just makes it look like where the metal's got the most hot and the most dark at the ends. So after that, there's a little bit of overspray, and I'm just putting a thin layer of black paint just to tidy that up a little bit. It's not super essential because you will be covering this with other colours, but because I want to use a pre-shading method, an underpainting method for this, I wanted to kind of return it back to black as much as I possibly could so I can get the best out of the natural shadow that builds up with that process. Again, work my way around the weapons arms as well and just do the same there and tidy it all up a bit. Now it's time to mask it all off. There's multiple options. I like to use liquid mask a lot. I'm using some artist masking tape here, and you'll notice some cling film as well. I was originally going to use that for the awkward shaped engine and smokestacks at the back, but in the end I ended up just using standard masking tape. It's not the most fun process, but at the end you can see we're all protected in those areas. Now it goes on to the underpainting for this miniature. So I treat this like a Zenithal. I'm using a primer here. The only reason I'm using it is because the colour is very nice and it works and it goes through the airbrush so well. You could just use a normal brown if you wanted, but this is a Vallejo surface primer leather brown. And what I'm doing first is where the light is going to catch, I'm first building up a subtle layer of brown. I'm doing it so that it leaves some natural shadow in as well. I do want to leave quite a lot of the black. I want there to be quite a contrast between light and dark on this miniature, sort of over accentuated and cartoonesque. That's just the style I'm going for this army. You'll see that I'm adding the light in the lower parts of the armor plates. That doesn't always match with logic, but again, it's a stylized effect that I'm going for. On the more raised areas, that kind of makes sense a little bit more, but you'll have to just bear with me. It's something that quite a lot of painters do, and I quite like the effect of it. And rather than always just placing all of your shadows underneath, it just gives a very, very pleasing transition on the armor areas. So completing the same processes on each shoulder. I thought about going for a black shoulder plate or something like that, but I decided to sort of really enforce the yellow look of this miniature. The next stage we continue and is a little bit more traditional Zenithal pre-highlight, and this is Dead White from Game Air. And again, I want to make sure that I leave some previous colour in, so I'm going to leave some of that brown, but I'm probably covering 3/4 of it, or maybe 2/3 of it in some areas, and going around reinforcing the highlights where I've already highlighted with the brown. And then when we add the very thin layer of yellow over the top as the next stage, it will really accentuate and will give you this lovely smooth transition from light to dark. For the top areas, I'm trying to sort of pop the colour in the middle more. It's a little bit harder to light. Obviously, it's the top of the miniature. You expect it to be its brightest, but I do want to have some shadow in there as well. So you have to make it up a little bit and just pick something that's pleasing to the eye rather than completely sensible based on where the sun would shine. And as before, I just go around and complete the same on the weapon arms as well. So this is the yellow I'm going to be using. It's a contrast Nazdrag yellow. These are fantastic to make into glazes. I've thinned this 1 part water to 2 parts contrast, and I'm just very lightly building it up slowly. I don't want to press too hard on the trigger on the airbrush, or you'll get this really dark layer. I can always go back over and make it a lot more rich. So the first layer is very lemony. After that I build it into this sort of deeper ochre, and what you'll see is that natural transition that was built up from the black through the brown to the white underpainting, as gives you this really nice effect. Again, completing this on all areas of the miniature. So at this time I actually started with the weapons arms, and when it comes to the main areas of the Dreadnought itself, you pretty much want to cover the whole thing. Now off camera I have added some liquid mask to cover over the eagle area on the front, and some of the Terminator emblems and things. I quite like the white effect that I had before, and it'd be much easier to paint over them. Now I could re-white them, but I thought I might as well mask them off and we'll go from there. Now once that's all done, I'm into sort of tidying up again and picking out little bits. So I've tidied up the white areas. I'm actually underpainting the lenses here. So I will paint a thin layer of paint over these a little bit later on. So I wanted to pick out the lens glares and little marks where the glass on the light is going to be. I also did a bit of an overbrush or a heavy dry brush over the pipes here, just picking up the texture a little bit, and I'm going to be using a contrast paint to pick them out afterwards. I also did the same for all the cabling around the side, and while that already has a metallic base layer, I'm just picking out the raised areas with white, and again all will come a little bit clearer once I move on to the next stages. Now the next stage of the white is to shade it, and you can either use Apothecary White or the Templar White from Express Colour. I find they're both very good. I'm sure the Army Painter one is as well. I haven't tried it yet, but I thinned it slightly with some medium, probably 50-50, and I'm just applying it all over those white areas, allowing it to pull. And what they do is essentially give you a grey glaze or shade just to sort of shadow in that white. I still want it to look quite bright and clear on this miniature. For the Terminator I used black for this area, but I really wanted this to stand out a little bit, look a little bit different. Now I'm moving on to picking out more detail. This is Contrast Flesh Tearers Red, and I'm just going around picking out all the seals. Then with Contrast Skeleton Horde, I'm going to go around and shade all of those oath parchments. There are a couple of areas of metallics which weren't done beforehand due to their small nature, so I'm going back to the decayed metal here and just picking out the barrels of the weapons on the chest. And also the edges and colourings of the lights and lenses. As we did with the airbrush earlier, I'm carrying on with black metal in those areas. Then on to Game Air Silver. We're now on to painting the lenses and glass themselves, and I'm using Contrast Warp Lightning here, and a thin layer over those lenses themselves just shows through that underpainted white lens there we did earlier on. And for one of the lenses I used the technical paint Spirit Stone Red just to make it stand out a little bit. Doing the underpainting for these really means you can be less precise with them and they still look fantastic. For the missile pods I've used some Incubi Darkness just to add a little bit of extra colour. I didn't want to go red again here, we already have a little bit of red on the seals and things, and that looks a little bit toy-like sometimes, so I decided to go for this sort of greyish blue colour. And then to highlight those I'm just using a 50-50 mix of the original base colour and some off-white from Vallejo. So now turning to Express Colour Black Lotus. This is a very rich dark black with a bluish tone to it, but it flows very well into the crevices and leaves the top areas quite clean, which is perfect for these very small detailed cables and things that I've already dry brushed the white. I just found a thin coat of those over what was already dry brushed and it had a really pleasing effect. Now to start highlighting all of those parchment areas, and I'm turning to dark sand from Vallejo to start with, just picking out the most highlighted areas. You can always add a little bit of white to the final mix to really make them pop at the end if you like. To highlight all those wax seals, I used Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. The Evil Sun Scarlet first, and then just a few dots of Wild Rider Red I like would catch them most. So I reached for some Contrast Black Legion now. This is the darker, more opaque version of the Contrast Blacks, and I'm just using it into these joint regions of the Dreadnought's legs. Now I'm using some speed paint from Army Painter Hardened Leather, and what I'm doing here is returning to those cables underneath the weapon arms. Now remember, they're already metallic with a dry brushed white, and what this does is produce a really nice sort of copper looking effect. And the nature of this Army Painter paint, it just flows so nicely into all the crevices that gives you a really nice effect. Now it's time to highlight and tidy up the white areas after the white glaze has dried. I'm using a mixture of off-white and grey white here as well from Vallejo. So the grey white first, and then a few touches of the off-white afterwards. It's quite important to remember to keep those paints well thinned. The off-white can be a little bit chalky, but it's still a pretty good white. And then the grey white itself is absolutely fantastic. It's very, very unchalky for something on the white spectrum of the paint. But keep them thinned, use medium or water, whatever you find works best, and just take your time. Now we're moving on to a dry brush stage, and I'm going to be using black metal first and then a little bit of Game Air Silver. I'm using these big kind of dry brushes. I've got some Artis Opus Series D that need replacing actually. I picked up some cheaper copies on Amazon, and they're actually not too bad, not quite as good, but these will do for this process. The idea is having very, very little paint on your dry brush, and I'm really just trying to pick out just the edge here. Now, I think this makes the metal look more worn and more realistic, and it also works in place of doing edge highlights, which I don't like to do on my big chunky models like this. I want them to look grim and dark. Even though I've gone for a nice bright eye-popping colour scheme, I do want the edges to look worn and things as well. I love the edge highlighting effect you get with miniatures, but it's not something I want to do for my playable armies. It takes too long, and this is also makes them look, as I said already, grim and dark, and I quite like the effect. So I continue to work my way around the miniature now with the lighter silver. Now the later stages will dull some of this down a little bit, and I may want to reinforce it. But again, I'm just trying to be super subtle here, and just where the light would catch or where the paint would wear the most, just adding some thin layers. What I'm really trying to avoid is flat streaking across the flat areas. So I am being super, super gentle, and there's not much paint on the brush. There we have a very nicely painted tabletop miniature, and if your style of painting isn't really to add oil washes and things, you could very much stop here, maybe pop a little bit of gloss varnish on before you add a decal or two, but this is pretty good and would look quite nice on the tabletop. But of course we're going to do more. So next up, I am adding some gloss varnish through the airbrush. Two reasons for this. One, it will protect the miniature when I do the oil stages, but most importantly for the next stage, which is adding some decals, the smooth surface really helps the decal adhere better. And then when you add the effects on top of the decal, so the microsol and microset, which I'll be using, it really helps blend that decal into the smooth area much more than it would over a flat matte area. Now the eagle-eyed of you may notice there's a discrepancy between this and the method used for the painting tutorial for the Terminator, only really with the purity seals, of which I painted early on and then masked off. There's no real reason for it. I just do things in slightly different orders sometimes. I'm trying to keep the gloss paint away from the seals as much as possible here. You can be quite targeted, but if I do get any on there, there'll be a matte coat afterwards to sort that out. Now while I'm waiting for the gloss to dry, it needs to be completely dry before I can add any decals. I like to cut corners and save time, so here I am adding some sand texture paint to the base. I'll talk a little bit more about the methods I'm using later on, but right now I'm going to need both of these to dry, so I thought I can get them down there and get the miniature out in the sun. So with those dry, I can add the decals. I'm using Microsot and Microcell here. One helps adhere the decal to the miniature, the other helps smooth it over. I will pop a link in here for my tutorial on using decals and applying them. You'll find much more detail about the process there. With the sand texture wet, I'm able to shade it using a 50-50 mix of medium and contrast skeleton horde. Then I covered the rock area with Cygor brown. That's already been sort of heavily pre-shaded anyway by adding the zenithal colours I did earlier and a bit of a white dry brush. And once the decals are dry, I painted over a very thin coat of gloss varnish just over those to protect them, and we're on to the next stage, which is using some oil wash. These are pre-mixed ones from the Soilworks range from Scale Colour. Now, the beauty, and I've talked about this before on videos, the beauty of using oils and enamels and things as well, pin washes, there's so many products out there now. Over washes, standard GW style washes, is that you can play with them much more afterwards using clean white spirit. They take a lot longer to fully dry, so you can make sure you're not left with any of those pooling and tide marks and things. If you want to, you can kind of always get lazy and slap it all over. Here I'm trying to target in the areas where dirt and grime would sort of stick, where there would be shadow, and where there are panel lines and things like that. I can paint these on, knowing if I make any mistakes I can play around and sort it afterwards, which I'll show you later on in the video. I can also paint some streaks and things down and feather those out afterwards, so even if they're not perfectly straight, it doesn't matter. The thing is, they just won't fully dry yet. Now, the gloss varnish is quite important here because it really protects the miniature. If you don't use a gloss varnish, you can still use these methods, but I think you need to be a lot more precise to be safer. So maybe using panel liners and really just generally sticking to the panel liners. Here I'm trying to weather it as well as shade those panels at the same time. So I'm working my way around the whole miniature. I'm using the same mix on the metallics as well. It works just as well on those, and it just really kind of shades those things for you, adds an extra layer of depth, adds something that looks like dirt when it dries as well, and is very much magic in the bottle the way Agrax Earthshade was. I think a lot of people are scared because it's oils, it's smelly and things like that, but once you try it and realise that it's really super easy, I find this is much quicker and much easier than doing the same thing with a pot of Agrax Earthshade. So the next stage to this is to tidy up, and I'm using some Artist White Spirit here. There's lots of stuff out there. You can buy Sansador. Basically, you want Artist White Spirit or Sansador or anything made for miniature painters, because they're not as strong and they're not as strong smelling, which will mean that the significant others and family members and pets in your house will thank you for not having something that means that everyone needs to leave the windows open. What I'm doing here is going around and tidying up around all of the areas where there'd be panel lines. Anywhere there's a tide mark or something like that, I'm just smoothing it out. So it's just a clean brush, a little bit of white spirit and a kitchen towel to take the excess off, and you literally clean it away. So where it's around the rivets and things, I'm just blending out a little bit, still leaving some around the rivet. And what you should be able to see there is this quite a pleasing, worn, dirty look effect, and I just love it. I think it's so easy. So you work your way around the miniature methodically, doing each panel at a time. So this is one of the areas there was a streak, and all I'm doing is just tidying up around it, working on the rivets and things first, and where that streak was, just working either side of it, turning it into the shape that I wanted, and then when it dries, it'll just give you this subtle mark like there's been some rain or something, and it's just left a little bit of dirt running down. Exactly the same method on the metallic areas as well. Again, I'm reinforcing where the lighter areas here are, rather than sort of painting in where you've painted in the oils. I'm cleaning away where I don't want them, leaving it in those recesses. Now once all that's fully dry, and leave it overnight if you can, but this stuff does dry fairly quick like I said, I'm just applying a matte varnish thinned here. Now I'm trying to keep it off the metallics. I don't want to dull the shine that's in those metallic paints. So I'm aiming here essentially at the yellow and white areas. And with an airbrush, if you're careful, you've got a lot of control about where you add that matte varnish. If you did this with a rattle can, you'd obviously go over all those metallics and dull them right down, which is fine if that's the effect you want to go for. But if, like me, you want to keep the metals quite shiny, the actual gloss varnish really helps do that. Now once all that's done and dry, I've grabbed my bottle of Game Air Silver again and I'm going back to the dry brushing. And I just want to pick out, not all of them, but a couple of the areas that have been dulled a little bit by the process we've just gone through there. So just the very edges where the light catches or where it's most worn to really make it pop. So then using the same colour, a little bit of torn off sponge from a miniatures packet and some tweezers, I'm just doing a few sponge chips here and there, just the things that kind of come off the area, so those most worn areas where the Dreadnought's been battered, maybe the ricochets of bullets and things like that, maybe it's rocks from blasts or just general wear and tear where it's walked through rough terrain and rocks, but again it just really adds to that kind of weathered look effect. Then using some Rhinox hide, I'm going to do the same thing, but with a sort of a brownish colour. Far less, this becomes dirt, and maybe where the paint's chipped down to the primer. I quite like to make sure I focus over some of the decals so they don't look too clean here, so it looks like there's imperfections. Not too much here, as I said, but just a few little brown marks here and there really seem to add to the effect. Now I'm using some contrast bile red here. The sides of the las cannon itself has some coils on it. Sometimes I paint these using an airbrush and a real glow effect. Sometimes I paint them as metallic or something. Sometimes I leave them. I think the official 40k studio paint job just has them left as the main gun colour. So I wanted to do something a little bit different here, going back to the red colour which we have as an accent, which we've seen on the purity seals and things. I'm just painting this very thinly into those crevices there, and I quite like the way it looks, and that's the only reason I've chose it really. I have no idea how this weapon is supposed to work lore wise, but I just quite like the way it looks, and that's the most important thing. So I'm using some contrast wildwood here just to paint in a few squiggly lines on the purity seals to show writing. Now what you can also see here is I'm a complete idiot. I managed to do it off camera. Now to brush in some dry pigments to the base to match the army scheme. So we have burnt sienna, and then we have this nice yellow, dark yellow ochre here. The idea is to start at one side with the more orange colour, blend it into the base here, completely dry. I won't be putting any fixative on afterwards. If you rub it into the crevices enough and blow the excess away, I find it's more than sufficient, and it gives you a really nice dry pleasing effect. And once I've gone halfway around the base with that, I'm going to use the yellow ochre and blend them in together, which is incredibly easy to do when dry. And at the end you get this really nice sort of Mars hot desert baked effect, which I really like. I wanted to add a little bit of effect coming out those metal pipes to the side, so I opted for dirty down rust. And when you apply this quite thick like this, it remains wet looking, and I just made it look like there was some dirty, almost dry, rusty water that had emitted from those half-buried pipes. Then, as I always do, I finish my miniatures with a plain black rim to the bases. Just my preferred option, paint them any way you like. And there we have the completed Dreadnought miniature, and I think it's pretty striking on the tabletop, but there weren't really many advanced techniques in there. And I appreciate if you're not an airbrush user, you would consider airbrushing as an advanced technique. But once you've had a little bit of a practice with an airbrush, you will find it easier than you think to do the preparation stages than I did here. If you haven't got an airbrush and you really don't want to get into doing it, but you'd like to have a similar effect, I'd recommend looking at dry brushing effects, more advanced dry brushing effects. If you look at the work that Byron has done at Artist Opus and the video tutorials he's done there, you could build up a very smooth transition from black to grey to white, or black to brown to white, as I've done here, using those large airbrushes, and then use the same method over the top that I have here. You could have to paint it on yourself, but you could still get a similar effect. Likewise, if you have an airbrush but you don't feel you've got the control to put the colours just where you wanted, again you could use that dry brushing as a base layer, and then just do the flat thinned colour and Nasdrag yellow with the airbrush over the top if you feel that's something you'd be comfortable with. But overall, I just like sharing the way I do things. I know people like to comment and ask me questions on some of my painted miniatures, and I think there's so many methods out there that people can paint miniatures. There's no right or wrong way. There's just lots of different techniques. But I've enjoyed doing this. I am looking forward to getting the rest of that very, very small force painted. And it can sit in my cabinet, and maybe once or twice I'll crack it out for a game, and it will be lots of fun. I hope you've enjoyed the video too. If you have, please consider giving us a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Do check out the other videos on there. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.